cylinder head. Let's join him. The workman installs a metal strap between the crankshaft hub and the machine. This strap will lock the moving parts of the compressor, preventing injury during the job. Now, there are several methods available to lock the machine, so check your facility procedures to see what method to use. After match marking the two inspection covers on this side of the machine, he starts to remove them. It's always best to match mark plates like this. When you reinstall them, there's less chance that they'll leak if they're installed the way they came off. The two inspection covers on this side are used to gain access to the piston rod packing, oil seals, and crosshead assembly. There are two more inspection covers just like them on the other side of the machine. Since this job is going to take some time, the worker wants to keep his parts in order. So by placing the screws in a plastic bag, there's less chance they'll get lost. This is particularly important if the job may be turned over to a second shift, or if another worker will have to reinstall these covers. With the screws out, the cover can now be removed. While the workman completes removing the inspection covers, I want to stress the importance of locking the compressor. Even though the wheels have been taken off, the compressor could still move slightly while you're working. If your hands are in the way of the piston or other moving parts, you could be hurt. So lock the compressor. After the inspection covers are off, the next step is to remove the cylinder head. Let's rejoin the worker now as he rigs the head off the machine. The workman has installed a chain fall to support the head as he removes the nuts from the studs. Again, he's using a plastic bag to store the nuts. Now, the cylinder head has to be guided off straight and true to prevent damage to the studs. So he'll use the chain fall to support the head as he pulls it off the machine. Before going any further, however, he puts on his leather gloves. This is to protect his hands during the rigging operation. Cylinder heads will very often stick to their gasket seating surfaces. So to remove them, the head must be jacked off the cylinder using jacking studs. By installing a stud on each side of the head, he can tighten up evenly on each stud. This pushes the head off straight and prevents damage to the studs. Remember, the chain fall will support the head during this operation. As with any rigging operation, at least two men should be used, one to control the load and one to control the chain fall. So having his helpers stand by to ensure that the head is evenly supported, the workman starts to turn in on the jacking studs. You'll notice that he takes a few turns on one stud, then a few on the other one. Again, this keeps the movement of the head even. Once the studs extend all the way through the head, they'll come in contact with the end of the cylinder. At that point, the head will start to move off. As you can see, the head is starting to pull away now. Once it breaks free, the workman will be able to guide it off with the help of his assistant. Now, keeping an even strain on the chainfall, the workman gently slides the head off of the cylinder and moves it over to the table. Notice how he keeps his feet out from under the load in case it should fall. The workman is careful not to catch his fingers as the helper uses the chainfall to lower the head onto the table. Since the chainfall isn't needed for a while, the helper moves it out of the way. The next step is to install 2 eye bolts into threaded holes in the top of the piston. These eye bolts will perform 2 functions. First, they'll act as handles to allow the workman to turn the piston and piston rod so that he can unscrew it from the crosshead assembly. Also, he'll be able to use the eye bolts to pull the piston and piston rod free of the machine. The preliminary steps are completed now. With the cylinder head and inspection covers out of the way, the workman can remove the piston rod from the crosshead. But before we go on, stop the tape. Review the steps we've seen so far with your instructor. With the inspection covers and cylinder head removed, the workman can continue the disassembly. The next step is to remove the piston rod. Let's join the job in progress. Before removing the piston rod from the crosshead, one of the workmen uses a set of inside calipers to measure the distance between the piston rod and the nut. This measurement will be useful later on when reinstalling the rod into the crosshead. It should be at about the same position it is now. Next, the other workman loosens the set screw that locks the nut in place. Another set screw on the crosshead assembly is also loosened. This one is used to lock the threaded piston rod into the crosshead assembly. With both set screws loose, the piston rod nut can be loosened using an open-end wrench. Once the nut is broken free, the piston rod can be turned out of the crosshead. Now, while one workman watches the progress at the crosshead, the other worker turns the piston using the eye bolts he installed earlier. Since the piston is rigidly attached to the rod, the whole unit will turn. By using a threaded connection between the rod and the crosshead, the length of the piston rod can be adjusted. This is useful in setting the clearances between the piston and the cylinder heads. The rod will have to be screwed out completely and then pulled free so that the workman can turn off the nut. Once the nut is turned off the rod, it's free to be pulled out of the machine from the cylinder head end. Let me take a moment to point out something. Even though the piston and rod can be removed separately, it's usually easier to take them out as a unit. Experience with the machines at your facility will help you determine which way is better. Let's rejoin the workman now. With the nut completely screwed off the piston rod, the helper will place it safely on the workbench. The nut will be stored with other parts below the bench. Now, before the rod is pulled out any further, the oil scraper seal has to be disassembled and supported. This particular type of seal is free to float on the piston rod. If the rod were pulled through the seal, the threaded portion of the rod could damage the sealing surfaces. To remove the seal, the cover plate housing has to come off. It's held in place by Allen screws. Using a little teamwork here makes the job go faster. So by working from both sides, the workmen remove the Allen screws. Now, as the last screw is removed, they're very careful to support the housing to keep it from falling down on the rod. Once the screw is out, the housing can be pushed up on the rod to get it out of the way and expose the seals. As you can see, two seals are installed. These seals are segmented and a spring is used to hold the pieces together. So after the rod is pulled out slightly, the helper gently eases the seals down the rod. The workmen take their time and use teamwork to perform this operation. Another pull allows the seals to be pushed up close to where the threaded portion begins. Now, as the seals are pulled onto the threaded portion, the helper is careful to support them. He wants to keep them from scraping along the threaded rod. Then the workman pulls the rod free, and the seals are simply lifted off. To protect them, the helper wraps the seals in a clean, lint-free towel. Then they're placed in a plastic bag to keep all the pieces together. These seals are delicate, so extra care is required to prevent damage. The housing simply slips off the rod. With the seal package and housing all together, the helper places them safely under the workbench. Now he's ready to rig the piston and rod out of the compressor. The first step is to pull the piston as far out as possible without it coming completely out of the cylinder. Then the workman wraps a strap around the piston to support it while moving it to the workbench. A strap works well for this because it won't scratch or damage the piston. Also, the strap will tighten around the piston as it's lifted, holding it steady. The workman keeps the tension on the strap so it stays in place around the piston. Once the strap is attached to the chainfall, the helper gently lifts the piston enough to allow the workman to slide it out of the cylinder. As the piston clears the cylinder, the workman supports the weight by holding the end of the rod. Then the helper raises the piston to the height of the table. They're careful not to let it slip as they move it towards the table. Once it's over the table, they simply lower it in place and remove the rigging. Now that the piston is removed, the next step